Mark had driven long hauls for nearly 15 years. For him, the highway was like a second home, endless stretches of asphalt surrounded by isolation. He liked it that way. No nagging deadlines, no phone calls, just the hum of the engine and the rhythmic pulse of the tires against the road. That night, though, something was different. It was late, the kind of hour when most truckers pulled into rest stops to grab coffee or a quick nap. Mark, however, preferred to keep moving. His load, a trailer filled with construction equipment, wasn't due until morning, but he wanted to make good time. He was halfway through a desolate highway deep in rural Idaho, where the forests loomed thick and the moon barely shone through the heavy canopy. That was when he saw it. The headlights of his rig illuminated a shape up ahead, lying in the middle of the road. At first, it looked like roadkill, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Not unusual. But then, Mark's stomach churned. Something was crouched over it. He squinted through the windshield, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the shape became clearer. It was a figure, hunched low, its shoulders jerking back and forth like it was tearing something apart. His first thought was that it was a person, maybe a stranded driver scavenging for supplies, or even someone sick or injured. But as the truck crept closer, Mark realized there was something wrong about the figure. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs spindly like sticks. The way it moved wasn't human. It was jerky and erratic, almost like it was glitching. Mark slowed the truck, his headlights washing over the scene. And that's when it looked up. The thing's face was wrong. Pale, almost featureless, like someone had stretched skin over a mannequin's head. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were nothing more than two hollow, black voids, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Mark slammed on the brakes. The truck lurched forward, screeching to a stop just a few feet away from the creature. It stared at him, head tilted unnaturally, its body still crouched over the mangled carcass of some animal. For a moment, they both stayed frozen. Then the thing did something that made Mark's blood turn to ice. It smiled. The grin stretched across its entire face, far wider than it should have been, the corners of its mouth splitting as if the skin was tearing. Then it stood, its long, spindly limbs unfolded like a spider, and it rose to its full height, easily 8 feet tall. The creature's shoulders slumped, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its hollow eyes locked onto Mark. Mark's heart pounded. He reached for the CB radio, his fingers trembling, but before he could speak, the creature let out a sound. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a scream. It was a laugh, high-pitched, guttural, and inhuman. Mark didn't think. He threw the truck into gear and hit the gas. The engine roared as the rig surged forward, and for a moment, he thought the creature would jump out of the way. But it didn't. Instead, it leapt toward the truck, its long arms slamming onto the hood. The impact jolted the cab, and Mark's breath caught as the creature's face pressed against the windshield, its teeth clacking against the glass. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into his soul, and its grin widened as it scratched the windshield with clawed, bony fingers. Mark swerved. The truck veered to the right, narrowly avoiding the ditch as he tried to shake the thing loose. But it wouldn't let go. The rig barreled down the highway, the creature clinging to the hood like a parasite. Its grin never faltered, its face never leaving the glass. Mark could barely keep his hands steady on the wheel. He flicked on the wipers, trying to dislodge the thing, but it only laughed again, a sound that made his skin crawl. Desperate, Mark slammed the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, the trailer lurching violently, and the creature went flying forward, hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Mark didn't wait to see if it would get up. He hit the gas again, the tires spinning before the rig lurched forward, leaving the thing behind. But as he sped down the road, his chest heaving, a terrible thought crept into his mind. What if it wasn't alone? The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and the empty highway ahead. For a moment, Mark allowed himself to hope that he was safe. But then he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of glowing eyes staring back at him from the shadows of the forest. Mark's stomach dropped. His hands tightened on the wheel as the eyes multiplied, flickering in and out of view, like they were following the truck from the trees. And then he heard it, the sound of claws scraping against metal, Mark's blood ran cold. He didn't want to look, but he did. In the side mirror, he saw it. The creature was back, running on all fours, its movements jerky and inhuman, its grin impossibly wide. And behind it, more figures emerged from the shadows. Tall, twisted shapes with hollow eyes and sharp teeth, all moving toward the truck. Mark floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as the rig sped down the highway. The trees blurred past, the headlights bouncing as the truck hit every crack and bump in the road. The creatures kept pace, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their laughter echoing through the night. Mark's chest heaved as he spotted a turnoff ahead, a narrow dirt road leading into the woods. He didn't know where it went, but he didn't care. He yanked the wheel, the truck skidding as it veered off the highway and onto the dirt path. The forest closed in around him, the trees so dense they blocked out the moonlight. The headlights barely illuminated the path ahead, but Mark kept driving, his heart pounding in his chest. The laughter faded, replaced by the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling. And then, silence. Mark slowed the truck, his breath shaky. He glanced in the mirrors, searching for any sign of the creatures. Nothing. The forest was still. Too still. Mark didn't stop. He drove through the night, not daring to slow down until he reached a small gas station on the edge of a town he didn't recognize. When he finally stepped out of the truck, his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the pavement, trembling. The gas station attendant found him there, muttering about hollow eyes and twisted smiles. Mark never drove that route again, and every time he passed roadkill on the highway, he couldn't help but shiver, because now he knew. Sometimes, the things you see on the road at night aren't human. The gas station was small, the kind of place truckers only stopped at when they were desperate. It sat at the intersection of two deserted highways, surrounded by nothing but endless fields and a few distant trees swaying in the breeze. The fluorescent lights above the pumps flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement below. Jack had just pulled his rig into the lot. It had been a long, grueling haul, and the gas station was a much-needed break. The place was almost empty, save for a couple of cars parked near the convenience store. He killed the engine and stepped out, stretching his legs before heading inside to grab a cup of coffee. He didn't know that he'd be walking into a situation that would change his life forever. The interior of the store was just as run down as the outside. The shelves were sparsely stocked, the air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, and the overhead lights buzzed loudly. Behind the counter stood a young woman. She looked like she couldn't have been older than 20, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her eyes darted nervously around the store, and Jack noticed her hand twitching slightly as she tapped the counter. Jack grabbed a coffee from the machine, the cup filling with steaming liquid as he glanced toward the woman. Something about her seemed off. "You all right?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. She startled slightly, her eyes snapping to his. "Yeah," she said quickly. Too quickly. "I'm fine." Jack didn't push it. He paid for the coffee and stepped back outside, the cool night air hitting him as he sipped the bitter drink. That's when he saw the van. It had pulled into the lot while he was inside. A beat-up old thing. The kind of van you'd see in movies about serial killers. The windows were tinted, the paint was peeling, and the engine rattled loudly as it idled near the entrance. Two men climbed out. They looked rough, one tall and wiry, the other shorter but muscular, both dressed in dirty clothes that had seen better days. They didn't glance at the pumps, didn't seem to be there for gas. Instead, they headed straight for the convenience store. Jack's instincts flared. Something about the way they moved, fast, purposeful, set him on edge. He stood near his rig, watching as the door to the store swung shut behind them. And then, through the glass, he saw the tall man pull something out of his jacket. A gun. Jack's heart jumped into his throat. He set the coffee cup on the hood of his truck and reached for his phone, dialing 911 as he ducked behind the cab. His voice was low and urgent as he explained the situation to the operator, describing the van, the men, and the gas station's location. "Stay on the line," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." But Jack wasn't sure there was time to wait. Through the store window, Jack could see the tall man waving the gun at the cashier. The shorter man had vaulted over the counter, shoving her to the ground as he rummaged through the cash register. Jack clenched his fists. He could hear her muffled voice, though he couldn't make out the words. She was pleading with him, begging. His chest tightened. She was just a kid, and she was alone. Jack glanced at the van. The driver's side door was still open, the keys dangling from the ignition. He crept toward it, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. The plan formed in his mind as he moved. If he could block the van with his rig, they'd have no way to escape. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all he could think of. He climbed back into his truck, started the engine, and slowly edged the massive vehicle forward. The rumble of the engine was loud in the quiet night, but the men inside didn't seem to notice. They were too busy shouting at the girl. The rig came to a stop just behind the van, boxing it in. Jack killed the engine again and grabbed a crowbar from behind his seat. He wasn't a violent man, but if those men tried to hurt her, he'd do what he had to. The store door burst open, and the two men came sprinting out, the taller one still clutching the gun. They froze when they saw the rig. "What the hell?" the shorter man snarled. The tall man's eyes darted around the lot, searching for whoever had moved the truck. Jack stepped out of the shadows, the crowbar held tightly in his hands. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The tall man raised the gun, pointing it directly at Jack. "Move the truck," he barked. Jack didn't flinch. Not happening. The man's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could shoot, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the night. The men panicked. The shorter one turned, trying to yank the van's side door open, but the rig blocked it completely. The taller man took a step toward Jack, his gun still raised. "You're dead," he snarled. Jack didn't wait. He swung the crowbar with all his strength, the metal connecting with the man's wrist. The gun flew out of his hand, clattering to the ground. The shorter man lunged at Jack, but Jack spun, bringing the crowbar down hard on the man's shoulder. He cried out in pain, stumbling backward. The sirens grew louder, and the men realized they were out of time. They bolted, sprinting toward the edge of the lot and disappearing into the darkness of the fields beyond. Jack stood there, breathing hard, the crowbar still clenched in his hands as the police cars pulled into the lot. The officers found the girl inside the store, shaken but unharmed. They took Jack's statement, nodding with grim expressions as he described what had happened. "You might have just saved her life," one of them said. Jack didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the gun lying on the pavement, its barrel glinting faintly in the flickering light. He left the gas station an hour later, the girl's quiet "thank you" still ringing in his ears. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt relieved that she was safe. But as he drove down the highway, his hands tight on the wheel, he couldn't shake the thought that things could have gone very differently. And he knew he'd never forget the look in the tall man's eyes, that cold, predatory stare. Because out here on the road, you're never really alone. And sometimes, it's not the miles that wear you down. It's the people you cross paths with. The highway was dead silent, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic clatter of tires on cracked asphalt. Tom Whitaker had been driving for nearly 10 hours straight, his eyes heavy, the coffee in his thermos long since gone cold. He had been a trucker for 20 years, but something about this route, this particular night, felt wrong. Maybe it was the thick, rolling fog creeping in from the fields, or the way the moon barely peeked through the cloud cover. Or maybe it was just the unnatural stillness of the road. Then, up ahead, something stepped onto the highway. A figure, standing right in the middle of the lane. Tom's heart jumped into his throat. His foot slammed the brakes, the truck shuddering violently as the tires screeched against the pavement. The headlights flooded the dark road ahead, illuminating the motionless figure. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. Tall, thin, too thin. His clothes were tattered and old, hanging off his bony frame like they belonged to someone else. His face was pale, almost grayish in the glow of the headlights. But what sent a chill down Tom's spine, what made his skin prickle with something worse than fear, was the way the man didn't move. Not an inch. He just stood there. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Jesus," "Buddy," he muttered, exhaling shakily. He leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look. Maybe the guy was in shock, a stranded driver needing help. Tom flicked his high beams on, and the man moved. Not forward, not backward. His head snapped toward the truck at an unnatural angle, his neck bending too far to the side. Tom's stomach turned. That wasn't normal. The radio crackled, startling him. "Breaker 19. Anyone got their ears on? You seeing this out here?" Tom grabbed the CB radio. "Yeah. You talking about the guy on the road?" A pause. Then, "Damn right I am. Been following you a few miles back. Saw him step right out in front of you." Tom swallowed hard. "You ever seen anything like this before?" Another pause. Then, in a lower voice, "Not that I'd want to admit." Tom's grip on the radio tightened. The man in the road hadn't moved since snapping his head toward the truck. And that's when Tom noticed something even worse. The man's feet weren't touching the ground. Tom's chest tightened. His pulse hammered in his ears. He wasn't the kind of guy to believe in ghosts. But this wasn't right. He could hear the other trucker breathing through the radio, waiting. Then, the figure twitched. A sharp, jerking motion, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Then another, and another, and then it started moving toward the truck. Fast, too fast. Tom didn't think. He slammed the gas, the truck lurching forward with a roar. The figure didn't stop. It kept coming, and then it vanished, just blinked out of existence as soon as the truck should have hit it. Tom's stomach dropped. "What the hell?" he whispered, his knuckles white against the wheel. The CB radio crackled again. "Did you just—" "It's gone, man. It just disappeared." Tom's breath came fast, shallow. He wiped sweat from his brow, eyes darting between the mirrors, the highway, the fog creeping in from the trees. His hands were still shaking when he reached for the radio, but before he could respond, something slammed into the back of the trailer. The entire truck jerked violently, the sound of metal groaning against impact. Tom's stomach flipped. He checked the mirrors. Nothing, just darkness. The CB crackled again, but the other trucker wasn't speaking anymore. Tom could hear breathing, not his own. Slow, shallow, too close. His blood turned to ice. And then, from the radio, a whisper. Low, raspy. "Why didn't you stop?" Tom nearly threw the radio across the cab. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart hammering so fast it hurt. He kept checking the mirrors. Still nothing. The highway stretched ahead, empty. No sign of the figure, no sign of whatever had slammed into the back of the truck. But he wasn't alone. He could feel it. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. He didn't know anymore. His hands ached from gripping the wheel. His breath fogged up the windshield, despite the heater being off. Then, just when he thought maybe, just maybe, it was over, something moved in the passenger seat. A low creak, like weight shifting on leather. Tom's body went rigid. He turned his head, slowly, and saw nothing. The seat was empty, but the imprint of something heavy was pressed into the leather. The fabric creased like someone had just been sitting there. His stomach twisted. The CB radio crackled once more. But this time, the voice that spoke wasn't the other trucker. "Why didn't you stop?" Tom slammed his foot on the gas. He didn't stop again until the sun came up. By the time he pulled into the next truck stop, his body felt like it had been through a war. He parked, cut the engine, and just sat there, his fingers still curled around the wheel, his mind replaying every moment of the last few hours. Then, a knock on his door. He nearly jumped out of his skin. It was the other trucker, a guy about his age, rough-looking, clearly just as shaken. Neither of them spoke at first. Then the other man exhaled. "Guess you saw it too." Tom nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. The man looked around, lowering his voice. "People talk about that stretch of road," he said. "Truckers who see that thing. A lot of them don't make it to their next stop." Tom felt cold all over. "Then why do we keep seeing it?" The trucker shook his head. "Hell if I know." Then he hesitated. "But I think it's looking for something." Tom never took that route again, and every time he drove alone at night, he kept his high beams low, because sometimes, when you see something on the road, it sees you too. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the night. The road was dark, empty, just mile after mile of silent blacktop. Eric Collins had been driving for nearly 14 hours straight, his body running on nothing but caffeine and sheer willpower. He knew he should have pulled over long ago, but the delivery had a strict deadline. He had to push through. His eyelids felt like lead, his vision blurring at the edges. He cranked down the window, letting the freezing night air slap him in the face. It helped, for a moment. Then, his eyes started to drift shut. Just for a second. Just for 1 second. And in that second, something stepped onto the road. Eric's eyes snapped open just as the shape loomed in his headlights. A person, standing in the middle of the highway. His heart slammed against his ribs as his instincts took over. His hands jerked the wheel, tires screeching against the pavement. The truck lurched violently, skidding sideways as he struggled to regain control. The trailer fishtailed, dragging him dangerously close to the edge of the road. For a brief, horrifying moment, he thought the whole rig would tip over. But then, silence. The truck shuddered to a stop, engine growling in protest. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. His fingers trembled against the wheel. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. But the road was empty. No one was there. Eric's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his pulse still hammering. He turned on his hazard lights, trying to catch his breath. "I didn't hit anyone," he muttered to himself, forcing the words out. There was no impact. No body. So where the hell had they gone? He grabbed his flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped out of the cab, boots crunching against the gravel. The night was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that felt wrong. He swept the flashlight across the pavement. Nothing. No footprints. No skid marks where a person might have jumped away. Just the empty highway stretching into the void. His skin crawled, because he knew he had seen someone. Eric swallowed hard, his breath visible in the cold night air. He turned, shining the light toward the trees lining the road. The branches swayed gently in the wind, their shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the pavement. A deep feeling of unease settled in his stomach. Then, something moved. A shadow, too tall, too thin, slipped between the trees. Eric's blood ran cold. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he aimed the beam at the spot. The trees stood still, unmoving. The wind had stopped. His entire body screamed at him to get back in the truck, but something kept him rooted in place. And then, he heard it. A voice, whispering, "You should have kept driving." Eric spun around, heart hammering. No one was there. The road remained empty, the forest silent. But the voice, it had been close. Too close. His breath quickened as he took a step backward. His gut told him to run. And then, something slammed against the side of his truck. The impact shook the entire cab. Eric jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. He spun, his beam of light sweeping across the side of the truck. Nothing. He took a step closer, the hair on his arms standing on end. The steel was dented, the imprint long and deep, like something had rammed into it with inhuman strength. His throat went dry. There was no way a person could have done that. Something was out here with him, watching, waiting. Eric bolted for the truck, yanking the door open and slamming it shut behind him. His hands shook as he jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. His headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. He didn't hesitate. He threw the truck into gear and hit the gas, the massive rig lurching forward. He didn't care about the speed limit. He just had to get away. For the next mile, everything felt normal. The highway stretched out before him, the fog rolling low over the asphalt. His grip on the wheel loosened slightly, but his eyes remained glued to the mirrors. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A shape standing in the middle of the road. His blood turned to ice, because it was the same figure, the same impossible shadow, waiting for him. Eric's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. He had two options: swerve again, or keep going. He gritted his teeth. He wasn't making the same mistake twice. His foot slammed on the accelerator, the truck barreling forward, the headlights illuminating the figure as it stood motionless in the center of the road. Then, at the last possible second, it disappeared. vanished into thin air. Eric's body went numb. His fingers trembled on the wheel, his pulse thundering in his ears. But then, the laughter started. It came from inside the cab. Low, guttural, inhuman. Eric's breath hitched. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The passenger seat creaked. Something shifted beside him. And then, a cold breath brushed against his ear, and a voice whispered, "You fell asleep?" Eric slammed the brakes. The truck skidded, tires screaming against the pavement. His heart pounded, his hands shaking as he threw himself out of the seat, scrambling to the other side of the cab. The passenger seat was empty, but the imprint of something heavy pressed into the fabric, like someone had just been sitting there. Eric didn't stop again until he reached a truck stop nearly 50 miles away. When he finally climbed out, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. He stumbled inside the diner, shaking as he ordered a coffee. The waitress gave him a worried look. "Rough night?" Eric didn't answer. He just stared at the reflection in the diner's window. And for a brief moment, just for a second, he saw the shadow again, standing outside, watching, waiting. Eric never drove through that stretch of road again. He doesn't know if he really fell asleep at the wheel that night, or if something wanted him to believe he had. But ever since then, every time he feels his eyelids grow heavy on a long drive, he remembers the voice and the whisper in his ear, "You fell asleep?" The road ahead was empty, stretching through the countryside with nothing but darkness beyond the reach of the truck's headlights. The hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio were the only sounds breaking the stillness of the night. Danny Holt was deep into his haul, making good time. The highway was quiet, just the way he liked it. No distractions, no traffic, just the open road. Then, out of nowhere, something hit the windshield. A loud, wet smack. Danny flinched, gripping the wheel tighter. It wasn't a bird. It was something else. Then it happened again, and again. Smack, smack, smack. Within seconds, his entire windshield was covered. Danny squinted through the glass, struggling to see. His wipers swiped back and forth, but the smears were thick, sticky, unnatural. Then, in the glow of his headlights, he finally saw what was hitting the truck. Bees. A swarm of them. Thousands, no, millions of bees slamming against the windshield, the hood, the grill. Their tiny bodies burst apart on impact, covering the truck in a thick, yellowish-brown slime. Danny's stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. He reached for the CB radio. "Anyone out here seeing this? There's a..." Before he could finish, the radio cut to static. Danny winced as the volume spiked, a sharp, piercing noise that made his teeth clench. Then, beneath the static, something else, a low, droning hum. Faint at first, then growing louder. Closer. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from outside. The truck lurched. Danny's breath caught as he felt the massive rig tilt to one side, as if something heavy had just landed on top of the trailer. The swarm wasn't just hitting the truck anymore. It was coating it. He hit the gas, the engine roaring as he tried to outrun whatever the hell was happening. The truck rumbled forward, plowing through the endless cloud of insects. But no matter how fast he drove, the bees didn't let up. They slammed against the windows, crawled into the vents, and then they started to get inside. Danny slapped at his neck, then his arms, feeling tiny legs crawling over his skin. He swerved, his vision blurring as the dashboard lights flickered. His lungs burned. The air was getting thick, filled with the sickly scent of honey and something rotting. Something was wrong. These weren't normal bees. Up ahead, a gas station sign flickered in the darkness. Danny barely hesitated. He yanked the wheel, the tires screeching as he pulled off the highway. The truck lurched onto the dirt lot, its brakes hissing as it skidded to a stop. He threw the door open, stumbling onto the pavement, swatting at the insects that crawled up his arms, his neck, his face. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the swarm was gone. Danny stood there, gasping for air. The truck was covered in them, a thick, writhing blanket of bees, moving like one living thing. But none of them touched the gas station, like they couldn't. He turned toward the building. The neon, open, sign buzzed faintly in the window, casting an eerie glow over the glass doors. And just beyond that glass, a man stood staring at him. Danny's pulse jumped. The man was motionless, his face obscured by the dim light. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed, not at Danny, at the truck, at the bees. Danny's throat felt dry. He turned back toward the rig, dread curling in his stomach. The bees had started to move. Not randomly, not chaotically. They were forming shapes, letters, words. And when Danny finally understood what they spelled, his knees nearly buckled. Bring it back. His breath hitched. His heart pounded against his ribs. What the hell did that mean? Something slammed against the inside of the truck. Danny jumped back, his pulse racing. Another hit, and another. Something was inside his trailer. Something that wanted out. The man in the gas station hadn't moved. Danny turned, raising a shaking hand. What the hell is going on? The man tilted his head. Then, finally, he spoke. You shouldn't have taken that load. Danny's blood ran cold. The trailer shook violently, the metal groaning under the pressure. The air was thick with the smell of honey, blood, and decay. Danny took a step back. What's in there? The man didn't answer. He just shook his head. You need to bring it back. Danny's mind raced. He thought about the cargo manifest, the destination, the unmarked crates he had been told not to open. What the hell was he hauling? Another bang from the trailer, louder this time. The bees swarmed faster, the words on the truck shifting. Too late. Danny's stomach twisted. Then, with a deafening metallic screech, the trailer doors burst open. The first thing he saw was the honey. It poured out of the trailer like thick, golden sludge, pooling onto the pavement. But the smell, it wasn't sweet. It was rancid. And inside that honey, something moved. Danny stumbled backward as a shape crawled out of the trailer. It was human-shaped, or at least it had been. But its skin was covered in pulsating honeycomb, its arms elongated, its face twisted into an unnatural grin. Bees crawled out of its mouth, its hollow eye sockets, its gaping wounds. And then, it turned its head toward Danny, and laughed. Danny ran. He didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't care about the truck, the cargo, the job. He just knew one thing. He was never coming back. The next morning, authorities found the abandoned rig, its trailer doors hanging open. The interior was empty. No honey, no bees, no body, just the words, scratched into the metal walls. You took it too far. Danny never hauled unmarked cargo again. And whenever he saw a single bee, hovering in the air, watching, he knew it hadn't forgotten. The night was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt heavier the longer you sat in it. Wes Carter had been driving for nearly 10 hours straight, his eyes heavy, his body sore. The highway stretched out endlessly, not a single pair of headlights in sight. He was miles from the next rest stop, but his bladder didn't care. The gas station coffee he'd downed hours ago was coming back with a vengeance. Sighing, Wes pulled onto the shoulder of the road, his rig idling as he reached for a flashlight. He'd been trucking for years, and though he hated stopping in the middle of nowhere, sometimes nature didn't give a damn about his schedule. The only sound was the low hum of the engine as he climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching against the gravel. Beyond the guardrail, the land stretched into dense, unkempt woods, the trees thick and motionless beneath the night sky. The moment he stepped past the guardrail, something shifted in the trees. A soft rustling, too soft for the wind, and too close. Wes hesitated, shining the flashlight toward the tree line. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating twisted branches and thick undergrowth. The forest was still, but the air felt wrong, too quiet, like something was holding its breath. His gut told him to just hold it and drive on, but his bladder had other plans. Just hurry, he muttered to himself, stepping a few feet into the brush. The moment he unzipped, the rustling came again. Closer this time. Wes froze. His fingers hovered over his belt, his breath shallow. His flashlight beam flickered, then steadied. Something was in there, watching. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, From the trees, he heard a sound. A whistle. Low. Slow. Mimicking. Wes's entire body went rigid. He knew that whistle. He had just done it himself a minute ago, humming a little tune out of habit, and now, something was whistling it back. His breath hitched. His instinct screamed at him to get back to the truck, to drive and never look back. But he stayed rooted in place, flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. Then, from the underbrush, a shape moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't trying to hide. It stood up, and it was tall. At first, he thought it was a man, but as the figure emerged from the trees, his stomach turned. Its limbs were too long, too thin, bending in ways a person's shouldn't. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over bones that jutted at odd angles. And its face was wrong. Too smooth, too featureless, except for the mouth, which was grinning. Wes stumbled backward, his boot catching on a root. The thing tilted its head, its body unnaturally stiff, as if adjusting to the movement. Then, it whistled again. The same damn tune. But this time, it was closer. It hadn't moved, but it was closer. Like the space between them had just shrunk. Wes turned and bolted for the truck. His flashlight swung wildly, catching glimpses of twisted trees, shifting shadows, and, oh God, more figures in the dark. They stood deep in the woods, barely visible beyond the light. All of them grinning, all of them whistling. The same, slow, mimicking sound. Wes's heart slammed against his ribs as he reached the truck, yanking the door open and throwing himself inside. His hands shook as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The headlights flooded the road, but the shoulder, the woods, the trees were empty. The figures were gone. The engine rumbled to life, the cab vibrating beneath him. His breath was still ragged, his fingers white-knuckled against the wheel. He slammed the truck into gear and pulled onto the road, tires skidding against gravel. He drove, faster than he should have, faster than he'd ever driven on a stretch of empty highway. And then, the CB radio crackled. Static hissed through the speakers. Then, beneath it, a voice. At first, it was garbled, faint, then, clear as day. A low, slow whistle. The same damn tune. Wes's stomach turned to ice. His shaking hand reached for the volume knob. Then, a voice, barely above a whisper. You should have finished. The radio cut to dead static. Wes's breath shook. He checked the mirrors, the road behind him stretching into pure darkness. Nothing was there, but his hands wouldn't stop trembling. His pulse wouldn't slow, because he knew. Something had followed him, and it was still out there, watching, waiting, whistling. Wes never stopped on the side of the road again, and every time he heard someone whistle in the dark, he remembered that thing in the woods, and the way it had smiled at him. The road was empty, stretching endlessly through the vast countryside. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind sweeping across the open fields. Ben Carter had been trucking for nearly 20 years, but he had never seen the highway this deserted. No other cars, no distant taillights, just the black asphalt cutting through the night. Then, out of nowhere, he saw something up ahead. A shape. No, multiple shapes, scattered across the road. Ben's grip on the wheel tightened as he slowed down, the high beams flooding the stretch of pavement ahead. His stomach turned. The road was covered in carcasses, dozens of them, some small, some large. Deer, coyotes, even what looked like a bear. Their bodies lay twisted and torn, scattered in a grotesque pattern across the asphalt. Some had been ripped open, their insides spilling out onto the pavement. Others were whole but completely still, as if they had just dropped dead where they stood. Ben's mouth went dry. Something was wrong. He slowed the rig to a crawl, carefully maneuvering around the bodies, his headlights casting long, eerie shadows over the gruesome scene. His mind raced. A pileup? A freak accident? Some kind of animal attack? But then he noticed something that made his skin crawl. None of the bodies had been hit by cars. There were no tire marks, no blood trails, no signs of skidding. Just perfectly intact animals, dropped in the middle of the road. Like something had placed them there. Ben's hands shook slightly as he reached for the CB radio. Breaker 19. Anyone got their ears on? Something weird on the highway up here, about 10 miles past exit 212. For a moment, silence. Then, a voice crackled through the static. Jesus, you seeing that too? Ben's pulse quickened. Yeah, he said. What the hell happened here? A long pause. Then the other trucker spoke, his voice lower. Don't stop. Just keep driving. Ben's stomach nodded. He checked his mirrors. The road behind him was still empty, the darkness unmoving, suffocating. What do you mean, don't stop? He asked. Another pause. Then, they're not dead. Ben's blood ran cold. A sharp thump echoed from somewhere outside the truck. Ben's breath hitched. He flicked his eyes to the side mirror. For a moment, he saw nothing but empty road. Then, a shape moved. A large, dark form. One of the carcasses twitched. Ben's heart slammed against his ribs. It was a coyote. Its body had been motionless, lying limp on the asphalt. Now, its legs twitched violently, as if being puppeted by invisible strings. Its head jerked upright, but something was wrong. Its neck bent at an impossible angle, bones cracking loudly. Then, in a single, horrific motion, it stood up. Ben slammed the gas. The engine roared as the truck lurched forward, tires skidding slightly against the pavement. In his side mirror, the coyote was staring directly at him. Its jaw hung open unnaturally wide, its eyes black and sunken. Then, as the truck sped away, it did something that made Ben's blood turn to ice. It smiled. The CB crackled again. You still there, driver? Ben's voice came out hoarse. What the hell is this? Another long pause. Then the other trucker spoke, his voice flat. You ever hear about the failed experiment? Ben swallowed hard, eyes flicking between the road and the mirror. What? The Animal Release Project. A few years back. Some government thing. Ben's stomach twisted. He had heard rumors. Some classified program about repopulating certain species in the wild. Reintroducing predators into lost habitats. But something had gone wrong. Very wrong. They dumped them here, the trucker continued. Right along this highway. Ben's hands tightened on the wheel. And he pressed. Static hissed for a moment before the man answered. They never died. A shape darted across the road ahead, forcing Ben to yank the wheel. His tires screeched, the truck jerking dangerously before straightening out. His pulse pounded. He had seen it. Another one of those things. But this time, it hadn't been an animal. It had been something else. Ben's mind raced. He thought about the reports he'd read, the ones that had been quickly buried in the news. Stories of animals acting strange, of hunters going missing, of things moving at night that shouldn't have existed. It had been called a failed experiment. But what if it hadn't failed at all? The CB crackled again. They're watching you, the voice said. Ben's stomach dropped. His breath came in shallow gasps as his eyes darted to the mirrors. And that's when he saw them. Figures, lurking just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. Tall, too tall, and not human. Ben's foot slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck roared down the highway, the landscape blurring past. His heart pounded, his hands aching from gripping the wheel too hard. In the mirror, the figures stood motionless, their hollow eyes following him. And just before the road curved, just before they vanished from sight, one of them raised a hand and waved. Ben didn't stop driving for another 200 miles. He didn't check his mirrors again, didn't pick up the CB radio, and when he finally pulled into a rest stop, parked beneath the bright fluorescent lights, and shut off the engine, he sat there for a long time, his hands still trembling. The next morning, he checked the news. No reports, no accidents, nothing about the road full of carcasses or the things in the woods. But Ben knew what he saw, and he knew one thing for certain. That wasn't a failed experiment. It was just the beginning. The highway was almost too quiet that night. David Locke had been a trucker for over 20 years, but something about the empty, fog-covered road unsettled him. The world beyond his headlights was pure black. The streetlights along this stretch of the turnpike either burned out or too dim to be useful. He had the radio off, which was unusual for him. No music, no CB chatter, just silence. Then, up ahead, he saw it. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road. A woman, alone. David slowed the rig slightly, his headlights casting long shadows as he approached. She wasn't waving for help. She just stood there, perfectly still, her pale face turned toward him. She wore an old-fashioned dress, something out of place on a lonely turnpike in the middle of the night. Her hair was long, tangled, and her arms hung at her sides, limp. As his truck rolled past, she moved. Not walking, not stepping, just shifting, her body snapping forward several feet without actually moving her legs. David's breath caught in his throat. His hands clenched the wheel. What the hell was that? He flicked his eyes to the mirrors. She was still there. Only now, she was closer. Much closer. Too close. She had been standing on the shoulder. Now, she was directly behind his trailer, standing on the center line of the highway, her dark eyes locked onto the truck. David's stomach twisted. He blinked, and she was gone. David's pulse thundered in his ears. He reached for the CB radio, needing to hear another voice, something to ground him. "Breaker 19, anyone got ears on?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Static. Then, a voice. Low, gravelly. "You saw her, didn't you?" David's breath hitched. He swallowed, gripping the mic tighter. "Who is she?" The CB crackled. "She's been out here for years. Drivers see her, and sometimes they don't make it to the next stop." David's fingers tightened on the wheel. This a local ghost story or something? A long pause. Then, "Keep driving, Locke. Whatever you do, don't stop." His name. Whoever was on the other end knew his name. David felt a chill crawl up his spine. He checked the mirrors again. Nothing. Just an endless stretch of dark road. He exhaled slowly, trying to push the fear from his chest. It had to be a prank. Then, something knocked on the passenger side window. From the outside, David's stomach turned to ice. He was doing 70 miles an hour down the turnpike. There was no way someone was outside his truck. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head, and there she was, face pressed against the glass, smiling. David jerked the wheel in panic, the truck lurching violently into the next lane. By the time he looked back, she was gone. His heart slammed against his ribs, his breathing ragged. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep the truck steady. He checked the mirrors again. Still nothing. The CB crackled once more. "She likes you," the voice said. David's chest tightened. He slammed the radio off. The miles blurred past. The darkness deepened. David refused to look at the mirrors anymore. He kept his eyes locked on the road ahead, ignoring the feeling in his gut that told him he wasn't alone. Then, a figure appeared in the middle of the highway. His heart seized. She was back, standing directly in his path. He had no time to brake, no time to react. The truck barreled straight through her. David braced for impact, but there was none. She vanished the second the truck hit her. David was done. He gunned the accelerator, pushing the rig as fast as it would go. The sooner he got off this stretch of road, the better. The fog thickened. The highway stretched into infinity. Then, the radio turned on by itself. Static poured through the speakers, and underneath it, a whisper. "Why didn't you stop?" David nearly lost control of the truck. His body was coated in sweat, his pulse pounding so hard it hurt. Then, the truck shut off. The engine died mid-drive. The dashboard went dark. The truck coasted to a slow, agonizing stop on the side of the road. David sat frozen, chest heaving. The only sound was the wind outside. And then, the passenger door clicked open. It swung outward on its own. A cold gust of wind swept through the cab. David stared, unblinking, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, from the darkness outside, a hand appeared, slowly, gripping the edge of the door. Then, she pulled herself inside. David screamed. His body reacted before his brain did. He scrambled out of the driver's seat, yanking the door handle, tumbling onto the asphalt. His knees hit the pavement hard, but he didn't care. He clawed his way to his feet, his breath ragged as he turned to look back at the cab. She was inside, sitting perfectly still in the passenger seat, watching him, smiling. Then, the truck started by itself. The headlights flared to life. The engine roared, and the truck drove off. Without him, David could only stand there, his chest rising and falling in panicked gasps as he watched his own rig disappear into the fog. With her inside, they found his truck the next morning, parked neatly at a rest stop 200 miles away. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's seat was empty, but in the passenger seat, a single handprint was pressed into the fabric. Small, delicate, and still ice cold. David never spoke about that night. He quit trucking a month later, but every now and then, he swears, when he drives past a dark highway at night, he can see her, standing just beyond the glow of the streetlights, waiting, smiling. The truck stop was nearly deserted at this hour. The neon sign buzzed dimly above the gas pumps, casting an eerie blue glow over the cracked pavement. Mike Holloway had seen a lot of shady places in his years on the road, but something about this one made his skin crawl. Maybe it was the flickering light in the bathroom, or the way the attendant behind the counter kept glancing nervously at the door. Or maybe it was the missing person flyers taped to the bulletin board by the entrance. A dozen faces, all truckers, and all gone without a trace. Mike filled his thermos with lukewarm coffee, giving the guy behind the counter a nod. The attendant, a skinny kid, barely out of his teens, looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Mike stepped outside, the cold night air hitting him like a wall. His rig was parked in the farthest corner of the lot, the only truck still there. That didn't sit right. This stop was usually packed at night, truckers needing sleep, fuel, food. But tonight, the lot was empty, and Mike had the distinct feeling he was being watched. He climbed into the cab, locking the doors out of habit. He had learned a long time ago that lonely truck stops weren't always safe. His CB radio crackled to life the second he sat down. Static. Then, a voice. Low. Rough. "You shouldn't have stopped here." Mike grabbed the receiver. "Who's this?" The radio hissed. Then, silence. Mike's jaw tightened. Probably just some idiot playing a prank. He switched off the radio and reached for his food, but then, a shadow moved across his windshield. His breath hitched. He turned toward the driver's side window, scanning the lot. Nothing. Just the dim glow of the truck stop, the empty pavement stretching beyond it. Then, a sound. A soft tapping, coming from the passenger door. Mike's stomach twisted. He wasn't parked near anyone. No other trucks. No cars. So who the hell was tapping on his door? Slowly, he reached for his pocket knife, flipping it open. The tapping came again. Then, a voice, low, almost playful. "Hey, driver. Need some company?" Mike's grip on the knife tightened. He knew that voice. Not personally, but in the way every trucker did. Lot lizards. Women, or sometimes men, who wandered truck stops looking for cash in exchange for company. But something about this one felt wrong. She sounded too calm, too rehearsed, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He didn't answer, didn't move. Then, the door handle jiggled. She was trying to open it. Mike's heart pounded. He never left his doors unlocked, but the way she was pulling, testing, it felt like she knew something he didn't. Then, the other door handle moved. His blood ran cold. Someone else was on the driver's side. He couldn't see them, but he heard it. The soft creak of metal, the gentle tug on the handle. Whoever they were, they weren't talking. Mike knew, right then and there, this wasn't a couple of lot lizards. This was something else. Something bad. He yanked the gear into reverse, his tires screeching as the truck lurched backward. The shadows outside moved fast, too fast, disappearing from view as he pulled away from the lot. His breath came fast and shallow, his hands clammy against the wheel. But then, a voice. Inside the cab. "That wasn't very polite, driver." Mike's blood froze. His passenger seat creaked. Someone was inside his truck, but the doors had never opened. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to look, and sitting there, smiling, was a man. Tall, gaunt, wearing a truck stop attendant's uniform. His name tag was smeared with something dark. Mike's gut twisted. It wasn't ink. The man tilted his head, that grin never faltering. "I always get a ride," he murmured. "Truckers never say no." Mike's pulse slammed against his ribs. His foot hit the brake, the truck jerking to a stop. He fumbled for his knife. The seat was empty. Mike scrambled out of the cab, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. He scanned the truck, inside, outside. Nothing. But as he looked back toward the truck stop, his heart stopped. The attendant, the real one, still standing behind the counter, staring straight at him, mouth slightly open, eyes wide with horror. Mike took a step forward, then the power cut out. The entire truck stop went black. The signs flickered out, the building swallowed by darkness. Mike's stomach twisted. Then, from the shadows of the lot, he saw them. People, standing just beyond the glow of his headlights, all facing him, not moving, not blinking, just watching. Mike jumped back into the cab, locking the doors. The figures in the lot tilted their heads, almost in unison. Then, they started walking, not toward the truck, toward the gas station, and inside, the attendant began to scream. Mike threw the truck into drive, his tires screeching against the pavement. He didn't stop, didn't look back, not even when the screaming cut off. 3 days later, he checked the news. Truck stop attendant missing, gas station abandoned, doors left swinging open, security footage wiped. The only thing left behind? A single message, scrawled in grease and blood on the bathroom mirror. "Don't pick him up." Mike never stopped at remote truck stops again, and every time he saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road, smiling just a little too wide, he kept driving, because he knew some people never leave the truck, and some things never should have gotten in. The prison cell was cold, the kind of cold that settled into the bones and never really left. The walls were dull, gray, and lifeless, just like the man sitting on the other side of the glass. Wayne Adam Ford, a former trucker, a serial killer, and the only reason the world even knew his name? Because he turned himself in. Ford sat motionless, his hands cuffed, his posture eerily relaxed. His eyes, however, were not. They were dark, empty, calculating, like he was still watching something even though there was nothing left to see. Across from him sat Detective Henry Crow, an aging investigator who had spent the last few months digging through Ford's past. The details were horrific. Women, hitchhikers, runaways, prostitutes, all picked up on desolate highways. Some were found in shallow graves. Some were never found at all. And one was carried into a police station by Ford himself. Her severed arm, neatly wrapped in a plastic bag. That was the moment the world learned his name. And now, Crow was here to learn why. "You could have kept going," Crow said, voice steady despite the nausea churning in his gut. Ford blinked slowly, expression unreadable. "I could have." Crow leaned forward. "But you didn't." A pause. Then, a faint smile. "You ever get tired of driving?" Ford asked. Crow didn't answer. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Ford's voice was calm, unnervingly smooth. "I drove for years," he continued. "Long hauls, short hauls. Didn't matter. Always moving. Always picking people up." His fingers twitched against the table, as if gripping a phantom steering wheel. People trust truckers. They see a rig pull over, and they think, "Here's a guy who can help me. Get me where I need to go." His smile widened. They never think it's the last ride they'll take. Crow swallowed the bile rising in his throat. The case files were graphic. Bodies found along interstate routes, dissected, mutilated, disposed of like garbage. Yet Ford had walked into a station calmly, as if he had just come to pay a speeding ticket. Like none of it had mattered. And that was the part Crow couldn't shake. Something had changed in him. Something had made him stop. And he needed to know what. Ford tilted his head. "You ever hear of mile marker 117? Crow narrowed his eyes. "What about it?" Ford exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. "I dropped a girl off there once." Crow's grip tightened on his pin. "Dropped off, or dumped?" Ford's smile didn't falter. And that was all the answer Crow needed. Mile marker 117 was a stretch of highway in Northern California. Sparse, remote, A place where no one would hear you scream. Ford's rig had passed through there many times, and according to the files, at least 3 of his victims had been last seen in that area. Crow flipped through the case notes, stomach twisting. One girl, 22 years old, last seen hitchhiking near a gas station. Another, 30, last seen outside a diner. Both had vanished. And the third? Never identified. Just another Jane Doe, dumped along a back road, her remains picked apart by animals. But Ford had come back here to talk, and that meant there was more to the story. Crow kept his voice steady. Tell me what happened that night. Ford's smile faded. His fingers tapped the metal table, slow and rhythmic, as if recalling something long buried. Then, he spoke. She was different. Crow raised an eyebrow. How so? Ford's gaze darkened. She got back up. A chill ran down Crow's spine. What? Ford's jaw clenched. I did everything the same, just like the others. His voice was tight now, lacking the eerie calm from earlier. Crow stared. For the first time since entering this room, he saw it. Fear. Ford was scared. I left her at mile marker 117, he muttered. I know I did. Crow's pulse quickened. But Ford's fingers curled into fists. But she, his breath hitched. I saw her. A week later. Crow frowned. That's impossible. The body was found, wasn't it? Ford shook his head. No, that's the thing. She was never found. Crow felt his skin crawl. Ford's voice dropped to a whisper. I was on the road. Another job. Another girl. He swallowed hard. And I saw her. Crow frowned. Where? Ford's jaw clenched. On the side of the road. Crow's breath hitched. Mile marker 117. She looked the same, Ford continued, his voice barely audible. Same clothes. Same hair. Same face. His hands trembled. But there was something wrong with her. Crow leaned in. Wrong how? Ford hesitated. She was smiling. A cold dread settled in Crow's stomach. Ford's next words were barely above a whisper. She lifted a hand. And she waved at me. Crow's mouth went dry. Ford inhaled sharply, his body rigid, his knuckles white. I never picked up another girl after that. His voice cracked. I turned myself in. I had to. Crow studied him. Because of guilt? Ford's eyes darkened. No, he murmured. Because I knew if I stayed out there, I'd see her again. Silence. The cold air pressed in around them, the walls closing in. Crow's fingers tightened on his pen. Do you think she was real? Ford looked up sharply. She was more real than the others. The interview ended shortly after. Ford gave no more names, no new details. Just sat there, silent, his eyes still seeing something no one else could. Crow walked out of the prison that night feeling heavier than he had in years. Because he knew, monsters like Wayne Adam Ford don't stop. They don't change. They don't wake up one day and grow a conscience. Something made him stop. Something that shouldn't have been there. And as Crow drove down that lonely stretch of highway, his fingers tightened on the wheel. Because up ahead, just past mile marker 117, a woman stood on the shoulder of the road, smiling, waiting, and then she waved.